So in theory, we are live with Borge. Hopefully everybody can hear us fine. Maybe you can just give us some feedback whether you can hear the audio fine and you can see us fine, but I think it should be okay. So this is going to be Q&A number 9, I believe, in the Sustainable Self-Development group. And we collected 8 or 9 of your questions this time, and we are going to answer these with Borge. And just a quick announcement, I guess, for the beginning, as of this time, so 26th August 2018, there's about 4 hours left of our pre-sale campaign for this training and nutritional product that we just put together. So if you haven't already, and if you're seeing this live, then I guess we recommend that you jump on the opportunity. So that's a little bit of housekeeping thing for the beginning. Borge, do you want anything to add to that little plug that I had in the beginning?
No, I think that's a good thing to just get in there. I've been working really hard to get the material out there and edit and just make it as good as possible. So this is going to be pretty close to leaving my legacy of my sustainable approach to training and nutrition, and also the mindset and daily habits side of things. So it's, in my opinion, a very good system.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, and really, if you enjoyed hearing about the nutrition and training principles that we've been talking about in these Q&As, and also a lot of the podcast episodes and solo videos, then you will definitely enjoy this program. So give that a go. So if you are interested and you haven't checked it out already, then head over to sustainableselfdevelopment.com, and then you can /SSD program. Actually, that's where you can access the program directly. And as of now, you can get it at a lowered pre-sale price. So that's all the shameless plugging for the beginning. And with that, let's get into this Q&A. So question number 1 is about drop sets and how that could be implemented in a training program smartly. So basically the question goes, could a drop set template access some of the benefits implicated in myo-reps? For example, maximal recruitment and fatigue of the motor units and muscle fibers with heavy load, and then using the consecutive drop in weight as a rest pause strategy. So what do we think about drop sets?
Yeah, drop sets are a viable strategy. The problem is that as you drop the load, the mechanical tension also drops. So like my reps really shine on loads from like 40% of 1 rep max to 75% of 1 rep max. So basically loads you can do for at least 10 to 12 reps. And if you start dropping the load by maybe 10 to 20% from that, it doesn't take more than maybe 1 or 2 drops. And then you're into the loading range that's not as effective. And doing a myo-rep set at the same load will provide both a metabolic stimulus, which is important, but also maintain a mechanical stimulus. Whereas with drop sets, you're kind of sacrificing the mechanical stimulus in order to get more metabolic stimulus. So in my opinion and in my experience, I tend to think that myo-reps are more effective. But yeah, for sure, there's some overlap there.
Yeah. So basically, the default should be myo-reps and drop sets. I guess is there like a best time to implement that? Perhaps, like in your opinion, like what would be a situation in which it could be viable? Because it seems like it's kind of in a no man's land.
Yeah, you're doing more total reps, and contrary to what most tend to think, they think that heavy loads are the most fatiguing, but in actuality, doing a lot of reps at light loads are the most fatiguing and takes more time to recover from. And so, like if your joints are hurting, if something doesn't feel right, and doing myo-reps is really intensive, which is why it's a foundation of the SSD training program. The first part of the cycle anyway. And if you for any reason don't feel up for doing a myo-rep set that day, or doing several sets at the same load, then a drop set is a very viable strategy to use. And it can also be used as sort of a finisher at the end of a heavy set if you want. But just keep in mind that there's some stuff to suggest that there are redundancy in these pathways. So if you already have like a high mechanical tension, heavy load set to stimulate hypertrophy, if you add too much metabolic stimulus to that, then it kind of detracts from the main signal. And so We don't have like any good data to show that, but I think that focusing on each separate pathway is more productive than trying to sort of like the shotgun approach and just do everything all at once. It sounds good in theory, but in practice, it doesn't really work that well.
Sure. Cool.
So yeah, I guess the conclusion or the answer to that question is that use drop sets whenever you feel like heavy loads are too brutal for you and you just need some unloading, and maybe you're short on time and you just want to get in like a quick workout. So drop sets are a quick way to just add some extra volume.
Right. Awesome. Cool. So next question is about shift work, and we sort of covered this in the previous Q&A when someone asked about getting good workouts with very little sleep. But what about just inconsistencies in circadian rhythms? So if someone has some days, let's say 4 or 5 days out of the week where they have a regular rhythm during their days and they wake up at the same time, go to bed at the same time, and have meals at regular times, but then have a couple of days when everything is just completely off because of job or whatever, active social life or what have you. To what extent do you think someone can combat these negative effects, and how frequently and or how much can someone deviate from their normal rhythms and not be too harmful?
Well, I actually just did a video on this since it's part of the SSD system, handling the consequences of shift work, because there are real consequences to constantly shifting your circadian rhythm around. So how much you can deviate from it, I would say that optimally you wouldn't deviate more than maybe 2 hours from your normal bedtime. That's like the optimal. But how much you can deviate without it affecting your recovery, that's going to be totally individual, since your resilience, your ability to handle stress is both genetic and a function of how optimal your lifestyle is already and how healthy you are. So if you are unhealthy and you have a lot of stuff going on outside of those circadian rhythm challenges, like if you have other life stressors, then you will not be able to handle shifts in circadian rhythms very well. So I would do as much as possible to maintain a consistent schedule. And if it's only like for 1 or 2 days out of the week, then like you could skip breakfast and maybe just have a small snack late at night when you're up. But try as much as possible to stick to the normal routine, and then just sort of do the deviation that needs to be deviated, but try to reduce the deviation as much as possible and get back into your normal rhythm as quickly as possible. And we know that the main inputs to the circadian rhythm is light and daylight and lack of such, and it's movement and staying active, and it's food. So using intermittent fasting strategies, or should we say time-restricted feeding strategies, combined with as strong light as possible and as dark bedroom as possible, will sort of provide a stronger input to the circadian rhythm and reset things much faster.
Awesome. Cool. I think there's nothing to add here. Cool. So the next question is about fast versus slow protein. So a lot of people have different opinions on this. So what do you think about the implications of fast versus slow digesting proteins in post-workout meals and in, depending on when you eat them during the day? So when you eat them first thing in the morning or late at night, how much do you think these things matter in the grand scheme of things?
I generally don't recommend fast proteins at all. Obviously, there's some studies showing that whey protein or something, like that will enhance muscle protein synthesis, like the anabolic process, more than slower proteins or slower digestible proteins in the post-workout period. But over time, in the long term, slower proteins and actually normal meals tend to be the best strategy, simply because actual muscle growth is a function of not just the muscle protein synthesis, but also reducing muscle protein breakdown. And so slower digestible proteins tend to maintain or reduce muscle protein breakdown. So the net result is in most cases better. So I would just go with normal meals and not worry about fast versus slow digestive proteins. And even for the final meal, if you make the final meal, let's say I prefer it around 6 or 7 o'clock, like 2 to 3, 4 hours before bedtime. And that's like a large meal of 60 grams of protein, and it's a whole food meal that will digest over the next 12 hours and supply amino acids. So it's not like you need to have a casein shake pre-bed or anything. And there was just a recent study comparing the pre-bed casein shake versus just having that protein shake earlier in the day. And the group that had the shake earlier in the day actually had better results than than the group ingesting it close to bedtime. So I think it's more about total protein and just eating whole food meals and not being concerned about quick versus slow proteins.
Yeah, would your recommendation change a little bit maybe if someone is working out later in the evening?
No, not really. No, I mean, if you're working out late in the evening, maybe if you eat like a large meal that's hard to digest, then that could affect your sleep, but so could working out late. And so just sort of eat to comfortable fullness, but meals late in the evening should not be large simply because it will be harder for you to digest them. So, and still, I wouldn't use a fast digested protein source at that time because you have the nightly fast to be concerned about. So I would still use like slower digested proteins for the final meal.
Sure thing. Cool. So next question was a little bit of a tricky one to untangle. But basically, the question is about deconditioning and the concept of the tissue's response to resistance training is dependent upon the condition of the tissue at the time or the sensitivity of the tissue at the time. And basically, the question asks, if I understand it well, is that if the tissue, when is maximally sensitive, then it can benefit from lower loads, then is it even necessary to increase the weight over time when training if you can just always resensitize the tissue to be maximally responsive to training? So could you just squat the same amount of weight and grow equally as well if you always manage to resensitize in between training bouts?
In theory, yes, you could. But see, in the real world, as you add more muscle mass and as you follow an effective training program, you are going to get stronger as well. So if you just keep reusing those same loads, you won't be working close to the fatigue point or failure point and thus achieve effective training. So, if you just keep doing 100 kilos for 10 reps and you're eventually able to do 20 reps for that load, then that's not going to be a very potent growth stimulus. So yeah, in theory, the deconditioning process enables you to use both lower loads and lower volumes at the start of a training cycle and still respond almost like a newbie. But the so-called protective or the so-called repeated bout effect, the RBE, which is a protective adaptation that the body mounts in response to training. So the muscle doesn't just grow larger and the nervous system doesn't just get more efficient. And you have cardiovascular adaptations and you have glycogen and capillarization and blood flow and blah blah blah. But there's also a protective effect so that you would not suffer damage from subsequent training bouts. And so this accumulates over time, over a training cycle. And so what we attempt to do with the two-week rest period is to reverse some of those protective adaptations. But you can't completely eliminate them. You're only reversing some of them. And there's going to be actual connective tissue and there's going to be some neural adaptations and stuff. So you're kind of just taking a couple of steps back, but you're not all the way back to newbie status at all. So recycling the loads is definitely possible, and I have done this and seen continued growth, and that's also what we have seen in a couple of recent studies. We're just taking that time off. It seems to show that you need at least 9 to 10 days. And that perhaps the 2 week, like 14 to 16 day point is optimal to achieve sufficient resensitization, but without losing actual muscle. And so you experience rapid growth initially, even with really light loads. But if you don't keep sort of increasing the loads over time as you get stronger, you will eventually run into the issue I just mentioned, that you're working far below your actual max.
Yeah, and I guess people would actually feel this in practice because the weights would just feel easy. Like you would notice that you're not even approaching failure ever, which is normally in the beginning perhaps of the training cycle, but over time you would notice that like you're just not pushing yourself, and you would intuitively increase the weight. So, um, and perhaps this so there is a follow up part of this question which goes so that if we are not that concerned with strength, because we are not necessarily talking about strength training, although now you just answered the question that we do still do increase the load over time. But then how do we actually gauge progress? Like, do you just take measurements, look at body fat percentage, or some kind of muscle mass proxies like DEXA, or like how do you actually gauge progress on this training program? But I guess still the load on the bar is the main indicator, right?
Yeah, I mean, load on the bar, although Jeremy Lennox has rightly so claimed that strength and muscle growth aren't tightly correlated, so the process of growing muscle through training will increase your strength, and the process of gaining strength will eventually lead to some muscle growth. But it's possible to train for one versus the other and sort of reduce the contribution from each. So strength is one proxy, but shouldn't be the only one. But tracking body weight and tracking body fat percentage through some like body fat calipers or DEXA or even what's it called, bioelectric impedance measurements, which is kind of sketchy in its accuracy, but over time you should have some physical measurements to confirm that you're actually growing muscle. Yeah, you can't just rely on strength.
Yeah, fair enough. Cool. Okay, so we have an interesting question about weighted carries or loaded carry. So the person who asked the question, unfortunately I don't have the name here, had the impression that you don't include loaded carries in your programs. And the question is, do you still any utility for those if you're not a strongman or CrossFit competitor or something like that?
This is obviously a Dan John fan, and I'm a big fan of him myself. So, I'm just going to say, and I'll probably, now that you say it, I'll probably add it to the like summary section of the program. Feel free to play around with stuff, with mobility, with prehab work, with activation work, with loaded carries, with strongman type exercises, and whatever stuff you want outside of the main program, as long as you don't sort of turn that into its own kind of thing. I mean, I do think there are some definite benefits if you're an athlete, and if you have some bottlenecks in your physique or in your in your body. So if you lack core strength and stability, then for sure loaded carries are awesome. I do them once in a while whenever possible, but again, it's probably a great thing for athletes. And Dan John being one that coaches a lot of athletes, it's that old saying that if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And Dan John is one of my favorite people in the industry, but I don't consider them as magical as he tends to think they are. And so it's not something I consider essential to every program, but it's a fun thing to play around with, and it's challenging, and I do think it has a place in just enjoying the training process. So if you enjoy them and you find them fun and challenging, feel free to add them, but I don't think they're essential for a strength or a muscle growth program or just looking good naked. For conditioning and for strength and for athletes, for sure, I do think they have a higher priority than others.
Yeah, fair enough. Cool. So next question is a popular topic. So in the last Q&A, you touched upon practices for lowering the body's settling point for body fat. So making lower body fat percentages more durable and comfortable over time. So could you just elaborate on these techniques, if you would?
Well, I elaborate on these techniques in the course. That's what the whole system is about. The nutritional approach is about lowering the settling point. And so instead of forcing lower body fat percentage through dieting and restriction, you make proper food choices and implement some strategies. So for instance, ketogenic diets and zero carb diets have this certain ability or I would say very noticeable ability to lower the brain's what should I say, perception of body fat percentage. So you tend to comfortably just and spontaneously just eat less food, even though you don't, even though you're not hungry, even though you're not restricting yourself. So you can eat to fullness and still spontaneously just eat less foods. And so depending on how broken the system is, I mean, we know that very obese people have like a broken system in the brain that, it sort of, they can eat several thousand calories and their brain still tells them that they need to eat more. And some people experience this with so-called trigger foods, that when they eat a certain food, a certain combination of flavors just makes you go crazy. You can't stop yourself. It's uncontrollable hunger. And even though you're physically full, you still can't stop yourself from just craving more calories and more foods. So yeah, there are, various techniques to do this, and in general, there's the whole lifestyle and stress management approach, where you have an optimal circadian rhythm. So that's like a very fundamental part of this. Regular sleep and wake cycles, regular meal timings, as you entrain this as much as possible. So specific techniques to manage your stress levels, since stress really plays into the whole adipostat, as it's called, the brain's perception of how much body fat you should have, but also how much food you should eat. And we all know that lack of sleep, you're just starving the next day, even though you don't really need those calories. And also strategic application of various dietary approaches, such as like a zero carb or even ketogenic diet, and just making sure you're getting the full spectrum of micronutrients that the body needs. You need the protein and you need the micronutrients to tell the brain that it has all the nutrients it needs, and thus it will sort of function normally, and you won't get those abnormal hunger signals. So that's as elaborate as I can make it for this Q&A session. It's way more than that, but it takes a couple of hours to go through it. So we don't have time for that here. It's beyond the scope of this Q&A.
Yeah, so perhaps in one sentence, it could be something like be well fed and provide the appropriate fuel for your body so that you're actually well fed, but then create the environment in which the brain can actually sense that you're well fed. Something like that.
Avoid starving yourself, and beware of the palatability and satiety of the foods that you choose. That would be some very important strategies to implement.
Awesome. Cool. So we have the next question, which is an interesting one, about when to stop dieting further, or what is a point at which it's probably a pretty good idea to not try to get leaner. So Martin Burkhan recommended a number which is your height in centimeters minus 110. So I guess for a 180 centimeter male, it would be like 70 kilos, at which point he would not attempt to get any leaner. So would you have any kind of general recommendations like that, either numerical or just some cues that someone can look at? And that's a good indication that they should try to focus on building muscle as opposed to try to get leaner.
Well, if you've been following the last Q&As, you know that I'm not a fan of cutting and bulking at all. So, and I don't have any numerical guidelines that I can provide anyone with, because it's going to vary tremendously. But obviously, if you're if you've been dieting for 3-4 months or more, and you're just feeling miserable, and everything indicates that you are feeling miserable, you lack energy and motivation, you have cravings, then for sure stop cutting. I think that's the best indicator you can have. If you're not progressing anymore, if you're feeling cold and you're freezing when everyone else is warm, you have all the symptoms of being subclinical hypothyroid, and the body has now perceived you being in an extended calorie deficit, and it's switching on that whole evolutionary program that's in place to preserve your life. It's not interested in whether you want to look good for the beach. It's actually preventing you from dropping body weight further, because you have been doing things probably too extreme, and or you haven't been taking care of your other lifestyle habits that we touched upon in the previous question.
Yeah, Yeah, that's fair enough. Cool. So, yeah, and I guess for a lot of guys, just a practical thing. Like a lot of guys are obsessed with getting abs, but when everybody around you is screaming at you that you're already way too skinny, then a lot of times is the environment. Some people don't really understand your goals and may have a different perspective on these things. But if a lot of people are saying that, maybe they have a point. Because a lot of times that happened in my life, and looking back at some of those pictures, like it's cringe worthy how skinny I starved myself. So just something to keep in mind. Cool. So the next question was a little bit of a difficult one again to untangle, but basically it's the question of a lot of recent evidence pointed towards the notion of multiple training days a week for the same muscle group might be better than just one, but not by as much as we thought earlier. So what do you think of this one? And if that is the case, that one training session could be almost as good as multiple training sessions, like why do you think is the reason behind that?
I think if you're using untrained and barely trained, you can see better gains. And if you're not accounting for the swelling seen, not actual tissue growth, which takes more than 8 to 12 weeks to be able to measure with any degree of like a high degree of accuracy, then for sure training the muscle once per week will lead to so much swelling, and also partly they condition the muscle between each bout that comparing once a week to twice a week still wins out, but there's not a huge difference, especially if you're not well trained. But as you get better trained, as you have more RBE, as we discussed earlier, as the body gets more efficient at switching on the various mechanisms, but still requires more of a stimulus or a more consistent stimulus, higher frequencies definitely win out over lower frequencies. And I would refer to Greg Knuckles' latest article on that, because it just, if you look at meta reviews, then depending on the statistical method they used and the inclusion criteria, and whether they accounted for training status, whether they accounted for total training volume, training level, training age, just subject individuality, then you can manipulate these numbers either way. So I think Greg's analysis was more on point, and it showed that for both muscle growth and strength, higher frequencies are usually better, where 3 to 4 times per week consistently was shown to be more effective than once or twice a week as you get more trained. So that's my perspective on it, and what I have been advocating for the last few years with great success, I should add.
Cool. Yeah, well, believe it or not, this was actually the last question that I selected here. I thought that we would need a bit more time to go through over these. So maybe just a follow-up question off of that, because we managed to create ourselves a bit of a time buffer. But what do you think? Just recently, someone linked to a good post recently from Menno, and he talked about the implication of higher frequency training. And it's interesting because he seems to be not as big of a proponent of high frequency training as he was before. He still employs it in his training practices, but he doesn't think that it's as much of a magic bullet as he thought earlier. And one thing that he wrote there, which I reflected on, is that training frequency is not an independent injury risk factor. Only total training volume is. And I commented that in my experience, there is just something inherently more injurious, or at least there is something about high frequency training that, at least in some people, in certain body parts, can just lead to more aches and pains and niggles. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in any given individual, genes, lifestyle, and your individual response, even your nutrition, especially your nutrition, I would say, can increase inflammation more than it will in others. So just doing like one set to failure, for instance, can increase inflammation, and also like connective tissue health and connective tissue remodeling takes much longer in some individuals. I have the same problem. So even just doing one set and submax, like not to failure, after like 4 to 5 days of daily training, and I do this consistently over time, I tend to accumulate some various aches and pains. So my connective tissue just can't keep up with the demands and adaptability of the muscle. So again, you need to take a systems approach to training and consider everything involved, not just what you can observe in the muscle tissue itself, but also bones, connective tissue, joints, and your overall lifestyle stress. So I reserve the high frequencies like 4 times per week or more for the most advanced clients that have everything in place and have the physiology to tolerate that frequency. And that hasn't been a lot throughout the years. Some of the more advanced elite powerlifters that are young and healthy can get away with it and thrive on it. But again, the most sustainable approach will have a training frequency around 2 to 3 times a week for most people, and a few can get away with 4 times per week. But if you want to do high frequency training, that should usually focus on the metabolic component. So doing occlusion training or even submaximal MyRep training, because doing an intense MyRep set, some people tend to think that you should go to absolute failure when you do MyReps, and I never recommended that. You should manage fatigue. And if you manage fatigue, you can be able to do daily MyRep training with light loads for up to 5-6 days in a row. But when you start incrementing the loads and getting into heavier loads, and also when you add volume, which so many people are intent on doing these days, you accumulate more inflammation and connective tissue damage, and so you need more time to recover from that. So if you want to try high frequency training, make sure that you're making the muscle burn and you're using light loads, and you should also consider some of those workouts being submaximal with a few reps in reserve. And then as you get into heavier loads, the frequency should drop to accommodate that. So I think for most people, when you're in the like 5 to 10 rep range and you're doing one of the sweet spot volumes that we've been discussing, then people with ordinary lives and stresses should stick to like twice a week, maybe 3 times per week at the most for a muscle group. But I would say closer to 2 times per week per muscle group for those people. So to conclude, I know where Menno is coming from, and I agree completely with him, simply because when I, first of all, and then him later on, started talking about this high frequency stuff, and based on the Norwegian Frequency Project and stuff, this was targeted towards advanced lifters that had all their ducks lined up in a row, all their recovery capacities optimized, and their circadian rhythm optimized, and nutrition and all that stuff. But and so that's probably just 3 to 5% of our listeners or our readers. But the other 95 to 97% of the readers that this does not apply to believe or think that they belong to this exclusive club. Yeah. And so that's when problems tend to crop up. It's when people are ahead of themselves and don't consider their own lifestyle and their own capacities and recovery abilities. And try to apply training methods and techniques and variables that are beyond their own level and beyond their ability to recover from.
Yeah. It's a really hard thing to grasp, I think, for a lot of us, that what the advanced people do, I think the way that a lot of us think about that is that they are more serious than us, so they do things that just work better. Whereas that's not the case. They are more advanced and they just need to push things a lot harder to make anything happen. And something like that could be applicable for them, but it doesn't mean that it works better than, for example, training 2 or 3 times a week. And it actually might be working better for you because you're in that blessed state when you can actually benefit from something more simple like that, more so than an advanced lifter. So,
like a central concept that I mentioned over and over again in the SSD system is the concept of hormesis, where even applying or ingesting a toxin at the correct dose or at a sufficiently low dose, it will lead to a positive adaptation. And everything you apply to the body in terms of a stressor, if it's at the correct dose, according to your own capacities and recovery abilities, it will lead to a positive adaptation. But as you add more of that stressor, you get into the toxic range and the maladaptive range, where the body is unable to adapt to that, and you just stagnate and at worst regress and get weaker or even injured. And this is what happens when you try to just look at average results from all of these scientific studies and from whatever these authorities and experts are talking about. Yes, they are trying to find what is optimal and leads to the maximal growth rates, but this is under certain conditions and certain contexts and for certain people for a certain amount of time. But in the long term, if you want a sustainable approach, you need to sort of, jack all of that down to a more sustainable dose that can actually guarantee that you achieve results over the long term. Instead of just always chasing that maximum and being on the verge of overdoing stuff all the time, and even actually overdoing it, which a lot of people tend to do, and which is why people are in this group in the first place. So I mean, what's the rush? Why do you want to use all of the tools at once instead of just picking the right tool for the right job at the right time, and then just trusting the process? And if that wasn't sufficient, if that wasn't enough, I mean, any stimulus, if it's beyond a certain minimum threshold, and that minimum threshold is actually much lower than most people think, will make you grow, will make you better, will improve. So just always chasing for that maximum just elevates the risk of injuring yourself or losing out. So I mean, if you want to do this for a few years, just try to find the minimum threshold and stay just above that. And I don't think you need to try to find the maximum recoverable volume. I think it's a worthless marker. It only tells you that at that point in time, you have accumulated so much fatigue from the volume you have done working up to that point, that now you are guaranteed, you have evidence that all of that stuff you have been doing up to now was too much, and now you're not gaining anything anymore. But I think a better strategy is just to figure out how much do I need to invest to get the maximum profits. This is what you do in all areas of your life. You find the sort of the optimal dose. You don't just try to find the maximum in everything. So enough rambling for me. We went beyond the allotted time here now. So it just boggles my mind that we have been so programmed to always go for maximum, go for gold, go for just chasing the optimal in to such a degree that we just burn ourselves out.
Yeah, I guess it always comes back to wanting results yesterday, and a lot of people just need to get out of that mindset.
But extreme approaches can provide extreme results, but it can also backfire, and it seems as if 9 times out of 10 it just does that. So especially when it comes to physiology and the body, just trying to to use my favorite analogy, just trying to chase the sunburn in order to get a suntan is just not a very viable or sustainable way to approach health in the long term.
Yeah, well said. Cool. Well, guys, so if this sounds interesting to you, and if you're interested in finding that amount, which is pretty much guaranteed to provide results, and just find that optimal zone when you're getting most of the benefits for, the minimum but sufficient and almost guaranteed to work type of workload, then you will probably be interested in our training program. And, if you're so passionate about this that you just want to, bet all your horses in one race and just try to find out what's the most amount that you can do, then this is probably not going to be for you, because we advocate sustainability over chasing short-term results here. So something to keep in mind. So I think we got to the end of this Q&A. So hopefully we've been able to provide you with some good information for you guys. So Borge, any closing words?
No, I think we'll most likely have to reduce the frequency of these Q&A sessions here, and now to attend to all of those who have so willingly and trusting us with their money, access to the membership, where we're gonna we will answer questions and help them on an individual level to get better results. So my time spent in the SSD Facebook group will have to be limited for the upcoming week, just to make sure that everyone is taken good care of.
We'll probably move into like a bi-weekly or so schedule, or we will see what the upcoming frequency will be. But hopefully you guys enjoy these weekly Q&As, and hopefully you got some nice value out of these. And with that, we want to thank you for your attention. Once again, go to sustainableselfdevelopment.com to get up to date with everything that we're doing. And if you're curious about this training and nutrition program that we've been plugging like crazy here, because we're really enthusiastic and just stoked that it's finally out, or is going to be out real soon, then go to sustainableselfdevelopment.com/SSD program. So that was our Q&A webinar for today. And with that, we thank for everyone's attention.